Hello art beaders, Becky here for artbeads.com, and today I am going to show you how to do the chenille stitch. It's a really pretty seed beading stitch that makes a lovely pattern that's perfect for making bracelets, and you only need a couple different bead sizes and a needle and a thread to get started. I'm showing the flat chenille stitch today. There are tubular chenille stitches, but today we're focusing on the flat chenille stitch. I am using two different TOHO seed beads. I've got a size A-dot seed bead here and a size 11-aught seed bead here. I'm also using TOHO 1G beading thread and a beading needle in size 12. I'm working with about an arm's length of beading thread, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a stopper bead to the tail end of my thread. This can be any kind of just extra bead you have laying around. I'm going to leave at least a 6-inch tail so I can weave that back into my work, and I'm coming back around through that bead, looping around it to stop it and keep it in place. Now my beads aren't going to fall off my string. So to get started with this stitch, I am going to string 8 of these bigger seed beads onto my thread. 4, 6, 8. Make sure I have 8 there. 2, 4, 6, 8. From here, I'm going to pick up one of my smaller turquoise beads and another bigger bead. And then another smaller bead. Once you've added that small bead, big bead, small bead, you're going to bring your thread through that second bead in the initial 8 you strung. So skip over that 8th bead and go through that second bead in the initial row of 8. From here you're going to go through another bead, just one more bead in that initial row. And pull your thread through. Alright, and now we're going to start adding little beads between this row of big beads. So I've picked up an 11-aught bead. I'm going to pass through the next 2 beads in the row. I'm going to pick up another 11-aught small turquoise bead, pass through the next 2 beads in the row. And I'm going to do that again. I only have 1 bead on this end to pass through. So I've picked up my small turquoise bead, and I'm going to pass through that last big bead on this first row. So it looks a little funky now, but it will start to take shape as we add more rows. From here, we're going to pick up a small bead and then a bigger bead. And then we're going to come back through that small turquoise bead we added in the last row. We're going to pick up 2 of these bigger beads and come through the next small turquoise bead over. We're going to pick up 2 of these bigger A-dot beads and pass our needle through the next small turquoise bead. Now this is where it gets a little crazy because we've got like all these extra beads on this end. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up 2 of these bigger beads, and we are going to pass through that next turquoise bead over, which is this one. And we have to kind of loop back around to start the next row. And this looks like kind of crazy because we're just starting this row. So you want these 2 beads to be on your end. You're going to pass through that bottom bead here. So it looks like there's 3 beads here, but once we get these rows formed, it will kind of shape up. So pass through that bead there on the end at the bottom. There we go. See how that kind of formed it up? And then we're going to come through this bead here, this end turquoise bead. And then we're going to come up through this big bead and then this big bead. There we go. So things are starting to take shape here. So next, we're coming out of that 8-aught bead there. We're going to pick up a small 11-aught bead. And we're going to pass through the next 2 8-aught beads. This is starting to kind of form the shape of our little pattern here. Getting everything together. We're going to pick up another small turquoise bead, pass through the next 2 larger 8-aught beads. Pick up another small 11-aught bead, that cute little turquoise bead, and then we're going to pass through the next 2 and the last 2 8-aught beads. That's really starting to get things taking shape, which is nice. All right, so we're coming out of that last large 8-aught bead in this row. So we're going to pick up 2 more of those larger beads and pass through that small turquoise bead from the last row. Going to pick up 2 more 8-aught beads and pass through the next turquoise 11-aught bead from the last row. Pick up 2 more of those larger 8-aught beads and pass through the next 11-aught bead in the previous row. Now we're going to pick up 2 more of those larger 8-aught beads. And you can see this is the end of the row, so there's no little blue turquoise bead to grab onto. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to loop through these 2 8-aught seed beads that are below. And then loop back up through that bead we just added, so it's coming between the 2 beads we just added. Just like that. From here, we're going to pick up 1 small bead and then pass through that last big bead that we added in the previous row. Then we're going to pick up a small turquoise bead and a larger 8-aught bead, and we're going to come back through that turquoise bead we just added. Just like that, and it makes this cute little, it's like fringe on the edge of on the piece. It's really fun. And then what we're going to do from here is we are going to pass through these last 2 8-aught beads in the previous row. and then add a small turquoise bead and pass through the next 2 A-dot beads in the row below. We're going to pick up another small turquoise 11-aught bead and pass through the next 2 8-aught beads. And we're going to do that again. We only have one more 8-aught bead in this row to go through, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through that last 8-aught bead in the row. And we're ready to continue. So this is the point where we start repeating steps. So to repeat the stitch, just come back to this point in the video and continue it through. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up another 11-aught turquoise bead and a bigger 8-aught bead. And we're going to come through that last 11-aught bead that we added in the previous row. And again, it makes that cute little fringe on the edge there. And then we're going to pick up 2 of these larger 8-aught beads and come through the next 11-aught bead in the previous row. Pick up 2 of these larger 8-aught beads and come through the next 11-aught bead in the previous row. We'll pick up 2 more. And we're going to come through that 11-aught bead in the previous row. And then we're going to come down through that that bead right below it to the diagonal in the row below that 11-aught bead that we're passing through. And then looping back up through this edge turquoise bead and passing through these 2 8-aught beads to get us in position for the next row. From here, we're going to pick up an 11-aught bead and then pass through the next 2 8-aught beads in the row. And do that 2 more times. So pick up an 11-aught bead and pass through the next 2 8-aught beads in the previous row. Pick up an 8-aught bead, or an 11-aught bead, excuse me, and then pass through the last 2 8-aught beads in the previous row. Starting the next row, we're picking up 2 of these larger 8-aught beads and going through that 11-aught bead added in the previous row. Picking up 2 of these 8-aught beads, going through that next 11-aught bead. We're going to pick up 2 more of those and do the same thing, going through that 11-aught bead. And then we're going to pick up 2 more. We don't have a little turquoise bead to go through, so we're going to loop through these 2 beads. And then loop back around through that first bead added. So we're between these last 2 beads. Just like that. And then we're going to add an 11-aught turquoise bead here. And then we're going to add another turquoise bead, another 8-aught bead, and come back through that last turquoise bead added. From here, we're going to pass through the next 2 adjacent 8-aught beads in the previous row. And add the 11-aught turquoise beads between. So we've added the 11-aught. We're going to pass through the next 2 8-aught beads. We're going to add that little turquoise bead and pass through the next 2 bigger beads. And then we're going to add an 11-aught turquoise bead and pass through that last 8-aught bead. And then we're in place to repeat this stitch again from the point where I said you would be repeating. So all you have to do is pick up another 11-aught bead and another big 8-aught bead and go through that last 11-aught bead, that last turquoise bead added. Now we're in place for this row. So we pick up 2 8-aught beads, pass through the next 11-aught bead in the previous row. So it's just a lot of looping back and forth. It's pretty intuitive once you get a few rows going, what you're supposed to do. The only things that you really need to remember are the turns on the rows. Those can get a little tricky, the turns and the loops on the rows. So for instance, this one is one of the tricky ones where you're going through that last 11-aught bead, but to get the thread in place, you have to go down through that adjacent 8-aught bead that's to the lower diagonal, and then come up through this fringe bead, I would call it, and then back up through these 2 beads to get it in place to add your next row of 11-aught beads. So it's kind of just the same little techniques over and over, and it makes this really lovely, intricate looking weave that I really like the use of the 2 different sizes together. You could use, my needle came off my thread, but that's okay. You could use 11-aught and 8-aught like I have. Some people do 15-aught, 11-aught. You could use all the same size beads, and that would kind of change the look up too. I kind of like the contrasting colors. You could do more similar colors for a tone-on-tone look. There's a lot of fun things you could do with this stitch. You could even make it wider or narrower. I would just always start with an even number here. So we started with 8 of those larger beads. You could start with 6, you could start with 10 or 12. There's a lot you can do with the flat chenille stitch. So it's a really fun stitch. I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. And thank you guys for joining me. I'll see you next time.